Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the Mexican War, more formally known as U.S. Mexico War or the Mexican-American War. Now, this is a big war between the United States and Mexico over territory, a vast amount of territory by the end of the war. Now, this is one of my favorite topics in the first half of U.S. history. That's what I did a lot of research on during grad school. So let's dig in. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what led up to the war itself, and then some of the aftermath of the war. So the first big catalyst for the war was the annexation of Texas. Texas, about 10 years earlier, had gained its independence during the Texas Revolution. They had defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto and forced him to sign a treaty, acknowledging Texas as an independent country. However, the problem with this is Mexico itself as a government never recognized the treaty and never recognized that Texas was independent. So after about a decade, 1846, when Texas gains annexation into the United States, there's a lot of issue with this because Mexico has never guaranteed and declared officially that Texas is its own independent country and can do what it wants. So there's this tension between the United States and Mexico about the future of Texas. Now, General Zachary Taylor is going to be sent into South Texas, particularly towards Corpus Christi, kind of the furthest most point that we officially think that the United States and Texas can reasonably claim. So he's going to be stationed his army of occupation at Corpus Christi. So you can kind of see that blue line towards the bottom. That's along the Nueces River, starting or ending in Corpus Christi and going up into the Texas Hill Country. Now that kind of shaded area pointing at with the arrow that says Nueces Strip, that's the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Now, for most of Spain and Mexican history, the province of Texas always ended at the Nueces River. However, Texas had been claiming that the Rio Grande was actually the southern boundary of Texas. So the resulting area is this Nueces Strip. So even if Mexico doesn't recognize Texas as independent, they certainly would never admit that the Rio Grande was the boundary and not the Nueces. So Mexico claims the Nueces River, Texas and the United States claims the Rio Grande. And this is where the heart of the conflict is going to be, because President James K. Polk is going to order Zachary Taylor to march south of Corpus Christi into this disputed Nueces Strip to try to provoke Mexico, because it's not just Texas that Polk wants. He also wants the lucrative ports in California as well, which is controlled by Mexico. So as we go forward, as Zachary Taylor marched further south, as he got closer to the Rio Grande, a Mexican army is going to cross north of the Rio Grande to confront Taylor. You'll see the top left, Thornton's ambush is kind of this first conflict where the first U.S. soldier will be killed, followed by two more battles, the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. But Thornton's ambush is what kicks the whole war off. One U.S. soldier will be killed, and this is a justification enough for Polk to ask for a declaration of war. Now, in his speech, Polk says American blood has been spilt on American soil. Now, this is a dubious statement because this is disputed territory. So if we pointed at a map, Congress might be like, well, it's not technically our territory, or we don't know if it's ours yet, so has it really been spilled on our soil? But nonetheless, it was an almost unanimous decision to go to war with Mexico, although there were a handful of people that opposed it. In particular, this guy. He's going to participate in what's known as the spot resolutions. Now, this is, always hard to tell without the beard, but this is Abraham Lincoln. And they're going to be, he and several other members in Congress are going to be asking for Polk and the people supporting the war to show them on a map. They say, point out the spot in which this blood was spilled, and then we can decide if we should actually go to war. But nonetheless, the resistance is few and far between, and the war goes forward. Now, very early on, an amendment to one of the funding bills for the war was attempted, called the Wilmot Proviso. This was added on, or they tried to add this on to a funding bill for the war. Now, what it proposed was that any new territory taken from Mexico would prohibit slavery. So it would stop the expansion of slavery. Now, although this amendment does not pass, it does make the war more focused on slavery than anyone ever intended. So this new territory, any territory we get, which is already kind of cocky on the U.S.'s side because we're assuming we're going to take this territory, but nonetheless, it makes the war very quickly about slavery. Now, there's several other factors going on. And I can see everything kind of shaded color was once controlled by Mexico. So basically everything except the blue part of Texas was still controlled by Mexico. And Mexico had been experiencing several major issues up to this point. So Mexico had a lot of competing political ideas. Ever since Mexico gained independence in 1821, it had been fairly unstable. You had the Federalists fighting for a more kind of state-level government. You had the Centralists fighting for a more centralized government in Mexico City. So you have a lot of political turmoil. Then you added the problem of almost constant Indian raids coming from kind of northwest Texas, the Comanche, raiding into northern Mexico, destabilizing the northern regions. And the U.S. is going to see this weakness and provoke this war with Mexico, not simply because we want Texas and California, but because we see Mexico as an unstable enemy. We see this as the perfect time. While Mexico is not fully able to defend itself, we're going to step in and attack. Now, the first part of the Mexican War, if my slide will shift, well, there's the problems facing Mexico. So political division, Comanche or Indian raids in northern Mexico, and then in particular the wealth of Monterrey. A lot of silver is being produced in Monterrey. But kind of the first step of the war, let's talk about the three major theaters or the areas in which the war is going to be fought. So you have northern Mexico, so right around the Rio Grande, and a few hundred miles south of the Rio Grande, but before you cross the major desert towards Mexico City. Then you have the Western campaign, which is going to be New Mexico and California, primarily, a little bit in Utah. Then you have Central Mexico, which is going to be down by Veracruz and the inland road going towards Mexico City. So these are the three major theaters, and we're going to talk about them in these three sections. So the first thing the U.S. government started to do, when the U.S. military started to do, was to begin blockading Mexican ports, slowly cutting off and strangling Mexican trade. See this kind of strategy done during the Civil War as well against the South. Now, one of the first major ports taken by Zachary Taylor was a little one called Brazos Santiago. You kind of see it on this map, the very southern tip of Texas, the southern portion of South Padre Island. You have Brazos Santiago, and it's a big trade hub for the city of Matamoros and Monterrey. A lot of supplies, resources go in and out, particularly silver is flowing out of Mexico through Brazos Santiago. So this is a very lucrative port to take. It's not very big, but it's very lucrative. And it's going to be the main kind of vein of supplies coming from the rest of the United States flowing into northern Mexico to support our armies there. So, Zachary Taylor, we talked about Thornton's ambush, but the main conflict is going to come first at Palo Alto, but a much smaller one at Resaca de la Palma. Now, Taylor is facing off General Pedro de Ampudia, who was stationed in Matamoros, and he's crossed the river to face off against Taylor. Now, the problem with the Battle of Palo Alto, the Mexican army decided they were going to set up a defensive line and wait for the Americans to attack them. Defense is always stronger. However, when the Americans arrived, they set up their battle lines, but their cannons could hit the Mexicans, but the Mexican smaller cannons couldn't reach the Americans. So this meant the Mexicans had to attack, and it did not go well. Our artillery, our cannons did a devastating show of force against the Mexicans, forcing them to retreat, resulting in the smaller battle the next day at Resaca de la Palma. Eventually, we win this skirmish as well, and they're forced to retreat back to Monterrey, in which Taylor very hastily chases down and establishes, as you can see on the map, Little Fort Texas. So it's initially called Fort Texas. It'll be renamed shortly Fort Brown for a soldier who will die there. So Major Jacob Brown is hit by cannon fire in an exchange at Fort Brown. He's one of the few soldiers killed at Fort Brown itself. The fort was very quickly built, but using West Point engineers, it was very well built. Now, what's unique about Major Brown is not only was he killed by a cannon, but a few days later, during another cannon barrage from the Mexican side, his gravesite was disturbed and he was unburied by more cannon fire. So he was killed twice over by cannons. And that got the fort renamed in his honor. Now you can kind of see that little squiggly A, or the A with a little squiggly line for the fort around it, is kind of facing off against the city of Matamoros. So this is a pretty quick growing city at this point in time in Mexico. And we're trying to siege it and take it without too much trouble. And when General Aguadilla realizes not a lot of support and reinforcements are coming to his aid, he decides the best course of action is to surrender the city to the United States. Now, in this fight, this kind of barrage across the river, the Rio Grande, you have something unique happening. The U.S. Army was very quickly established, and recruits were needed to go fight this war in Mexico. And one of the biggest groups that was being drawn upon was very recent immigrants from Ireland. Now, Ireland is a predominantly Catholic nation at this point. So particularly the group that are coming from Ireland are predominantly Catholic. So when they arrive, they don't have anything to start with. They're poor, don't have a lot of supplies or food or any prospects on life. And the Army offers them steady pay, food, if they just fight for the United States. So they sign up. And they're very quickly shipped off to Mexico to fight against the Mexican army. The problem with this is when they get in the army, the United States is dominated by Protestants. And Protestants and Catholics in the mid-1800s don't get along great at this point. There's a lot of mistrust between the two. So you have a bunch of Irish Catholics serving in the U.S. Army for a bunch of Protestant officers. Then, when these Irish guys get down to South Texas, they're looking across the river at Mexico, and they're like, why are we fighting against Mexicans who are also Catholic, our religious brethren? So a group of these Irish guys are going to abandon, about 100 or so are going to defect from the United States and swim across the river and join Mexico. And they'll be known as the Battalion de San Patricio, or St. Patrick's Battalion, for the patron saint of Ireland. Now, these guys are going to be seen as traitors in the United States, but for Mexico, they're a big, popular thing. Even the museum to the Mexican-American War in Mexico City has a lot about the St. Patrick's Battalion. So this is an interesting group. Now, going on with the capture of the city of Matamoros. We have taken our first major city in Mexico, and it's kind of the first time the U.S. Army has gone beyond U.S. borders and captured a major enemy city by force. Now, very quickly, General Taylor is going to begin moving upriver. You see Reynosa, and then Camargo is going to be the next big target. Very quickly, we take Camargo. Not a lot of fighting there, but the goal is to turn kind of southwest and go towards Monterrey, kind of the biggest, wealthiest city in northern Mexico. And we're going to be using small steamships to migrate and move our troops and supplies upriver. During the war, we were very lucky. The river was kind of swollen from a lot of rain, so these small steamships were able to go up and down the river. This is going to have some unintended results. Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy are going to be some of these riverboat captains that are going to be working for the Army, making a lot of money off government contracts, and then after the war, turn this kind of riverboat empire and company into massive land acquisitions. So take the money they made during the war and transfer those connections with the Army, that trade, that business that'll continue after the war for a while, and translate it into building some of the biggest ranches in South Texas. So the King Ranch today is still a very significant cultural influence in South Texas. Now, as Zachary Taylor's army moves forward, if my slide will change, this leads us into the Battle of Monterrey. Now, Monterrey is a very populous city, very well defended, and it's going to be hard street to street, door to door fighting. So you'll see on the map, it's a little small, I know, but you'll see an officer named Worth. This is where Fort Worth is going to get its namesake from. He's going to fight his way around kind of the western portion of the city, trying to come around from the southern hills, while Taylor and his men will attack head on. This is going to be brutal fighting. Very brutal in such that the Texans kind of have to teach the rest of the U.S. Army how to fight in this method. So instead of fighting down the streets, the Texans began equipping axes and hammers and smashing their way through the adobe walls so you can fight through the buildings instead of out in the open streets. But after several days of brutal, bloody fighting, we managed to fight to an advantageous stalemate. So much so that the U.S. Army were running out of ammo. We have the upper hand, but the Mexican army is still very well dug in. But the Mexican general, much like Ampudia, saw that no reinforcements were coming. So he makes a deal with Taylor. If Taylor will take care of his wounded soldiers, he will surrender the city to General Taylor. So the Mexican general and his remaining forces leave the city, surrendering it to the United States and to Taylor in what's known as the Monterrey Armistice. Now, this agreement, this armistice, this ceasefire, is typically something made by politicians or the president. But in this case, Taylor made this of his own accord, and this is going to cause some tension between Zachary Taylor as a general and his boss, the president, James K. Polk. Polk does not like that Taylor did this of his own accord, even though Taylor really did need a kind of break, some breathing room. The next big conflict that Taylor is going to have to deal with is from Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. You probably know him from Texas Revolution and the fight at the Alamo and San Jacinto. Well, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna has managed to restore himself to power, build an army, and march north to confront Taylor. So you kind of see where the bottom of the pink line is marching north. Santa Anna managed to march across an entire desert while building his army. This is a pretty impressive feat, nonetheless. And this leads us to the Battle of Buena Vista, of good views, of good scenic views. It's a very kind of iconic place. You can kind of see from the right-hand picture, you have these big valleys, ditches. So you have these plateaus where the armies are, but then they have to fight through, down, and over. Now, Zachary Taylor's army is outnumbered, almost 2-1. And Santa Anna thinks he's going to be able to use numbers to overwhelm the U.S. forces. And it almost works. The battle will last all day. And the only thing that saves Taylor's army is his artillery, yet again. Instead of leaving the artillery in the back to shoot over, they actually bring the artillery up to the front lines, point it down these valleys as the Mexican troops are attacking up. They just unload, basically turning their cannons into giant shotguns to rip the Mexican troops apart. This is bloody, brutal fighting, and the Americans barely hold on. But we managed to endure, survive the day. However, that night, as the U.S. troops were regrouping, many of Taylor's officers came to him and said, "General, we need to surrender. We need to pull back to Monterrey." And Taylor said, "No, I will tell us when we're going to surrender. I will make that decision, and we are not going yet. Resupply, refit, prepare for battle tomorrow." So Taylor was dead set on winning this battle. The next morning, when the soldiers looked out across the battlefield, Santa Anna and his army were gone. They had surrendered the battlefield. What had happened was Santa Anna had learned that an attempted coup, seizing of power by a rival, had occurred in Mexico City, and he needed to take his army back south to reestablish control. So you can see the instability of the Mexican government helps Taylor win and survive the Battle of Buena Vista, which could have gone very differently if Santa Anna had fought one more day. But despite his army being virtually crippled, Taylor wins the battle, technically, and secures northern Mexico for the United States. But it's going to be after the Battle of Buena Vista that Taylor will not do much. He'll basically occupy the north, but you won't see any major action from Taylor for pretty much the rest of the war. And this brings us to the Western Theater, us pushing west towards New Mexico, Utah, and ultimately our goal in California. So you have Stephen Kearny and John C. Fremont. So Fremont will be heading out towards California, and Kearny will be going out towards New Mexico, eventually making his way to California as well. Now, what's interesting about this Western campaign is what's called the Mormon Battalion. The Mormons have been persecuted in the United States for a long time, so they fled to Mexican territory in Utah by the Great Salt Lake. We had fought several fights with the Mormons up to this point. It's going to be during this war that we actually try to make peace, and the Mormons volunteer several troops. And what becomes known as the Mormon Battalion, the only religiously organized U.S. Army unit ever to serve in the U.S. Army. Now, what's kind of bittersweet about this is that we do get these Mormon troops, but they march. You kind of see the path that they marched all the way around the American Southwest, but they never actually got into an actual fight. No, they didn't actually do any fighting. By the time they made it home, making this whole big circuit, they were worn out, bedraggled, their clothes were gone, their shoes were gone. They looked rough, like they had seen a war, but all they'd really done was march thousands of miles across the Southwest. But nonetheless, slowly we are beginning to take the West. Santa Fe had long had established relations with places like Missouri, had a trade called the Santa Fe Trail that ran up across the Southwest from Santa Fe to Independence, Missouri. So you have some connections. So when the U.S. Army arrives, it's not too much of a fight. They generally capitulate and accept the U.S. as their new leaders. And New Mexico falls to the United States fairly quickly. We'll see one major uprising, but for the most part, it's a fairly bloodless conflict in New Mexico. California is going to be a little bit different. As our troops make it out to California, the Navy is coming around the southern tip of South America, coming up to California to try to seize control. Now, the Californios, the Mexicans living in California, see this war as an opportunity to break away and create their own independent republic. So you have these kind of different factions all fighting for their own ideas. So you have Commodore Stockton from the U.S. Navy trying to seize control. You have Stephen Kearny from the U.S. Army. You have John C. Fremont, also from the Army. So they're vying over who's going to get credit for taking over California. Then you have the California Republic, led by the Californios, trying to establish their own independent government. So you have the three U.S. guys fighting the Californios. Then you have the three of them having this kind of tug of war over who's going to get credit. And it turns into a big mess. But nonetheless, California is ultimately taken, leading us to the third theater. We've taken the West, we've taken northern Mexico, but Mexico itself has not surrendered. So we have to capture Mexico City. General Winfield Scott is a big general of the time. He's the overall commander of the U.S. Army, and he's going to get the job of attacking Mexico City. So the beginning of his campaign is going to launch this massive 10,000-man invasion of the Mexican coast at a place called Veracruz. Now, this is the single most impressive landing up to this point pretty much in history, but certainly for the United States. Within about 4 or 5 hours, we land 10,000 men. The first wave comes in the line of battle, ready to fight the hill, the sand cover, the sand dunes, and attack and do all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, no Mexicans were there to defend. And very quickly, we established what's known as the Siege of Veracruz, where we surround the city of Veracruz and wait it out, trying to capture it. And we're going to bombard the city, forcing it to surrender. Now, we need Veracruz because it's a major port, and we can supply our troops, bring resources in, land more troops, all this much easier if we have a port. Now, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is from the state of Veracruz, which has the city of Veracruz also. So when he hears this gets attacked, he leaves, he has returned and established control of Mexico City after Buena Vista, and he is now marching east towards Veracruz, trying to liberate his home state. And he's going to face off against the United States and against Winfield Scott at a place called Cerro Gordo, called kind of the Fat Pass, or this kind of mountainous pass area. Now, Santa Anna thinks because he knows the area, he's going to surprise the United States and catch Winfield Scott off guard. But Scott, using his men and scouts very well, realizes the ambush that's being laid by Santa Anna and ends up surprise attacking Santa Anna himself. They actually drag cannons up over this kind of cliff area and come around from behind and catch Santa Anna off guard. So they actually turn the trap against Santa Anna, forcing him to retreat back towards Mexico City. Eventually, we fight our way to Puebla, one of the biggest cities before Mexico City. We ultimately capture it, and this is going to be where we pause for a little bit, hoping that Mexico will come to some sort of peace agreement. They do not, and the war continues. Then we begin fighting into a series of battles in the outskirts of Mexico City. One of the biggest is the Battle of Churubusco. There's a lot of little ones kind of fighting our way up. The culminating battle of the war is the Battle of Chapultepec. Now, this is the big palace or castle in kind of the main hill in Mexico City. It's kind of one of the dominant features. Today, you can kind of visit it. You can kind of walk your way up this winding path to get to the big museum of the palace and the castle. But this, at this point in time, was still a defensive position, and it was going to be a hard thing to fight. And we tried bombarding it. We tried different things to coerce them to surrender, but we couldn't do it. And ultimately, Winfield Scott's going to have to launch a frontal assault to take the castle. And it works surprisingly well, although there's kind of this bittersweet ending to it. Some of the last defenders of Chapultepec were the military academy students. So these young boys, 10, 12, 15 years old, rather than surrender to the Americans, they threw themselves from the battlements to their deaths. And they're kind of seen as martyrs for the cause of Mexican kind of freedom, Mexican defense, even today. But we have taken Chapultepec, we've captured Mexico City, so we expect the war to be over. And you can see here, U.S. troops are occupying the Zocalo, or the central square of Mexico City. But the problem is, the Mexican government was so destabilized, we couldn't find a government to make a peace treaty with. President Polk will send Nicholas Trist down to make this agreement, but it takes him several months to find a government to make peace with. But ultimately, we will find a government in kind of outskirts town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we'll make the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had 5 major parts. So it confirms that Texas is in fact an independent country, able to join the United States. The final border between Texas and Mexico, and the U.S. and Mexico, will be decided later. But the Rio Grande would be the southern boundary of Texas. The United States promises to treat all Mexicans living within what are now U.S. boundaries as equal citizens. We promise this. We won't live up to it, but we do promise it. The U.S. promised to stop Indian raids from U.S. territory into northern Mexico, primarily the Comanche. We promised this, and we are unable to do this one as well. And finally, the United States feels a little guilty for taking so much territory, because we took Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, Utah, California. We took a vast portion of Mexico. So we give those territories known as the Mexican Cession, and we give $15 million to Mexico. So this is a lot of money to Mexico at this time, but it's basically a Band-Aid over a gaping wound. It's kind of an apology to Mexico for taking all this land. So you can kind of see everything in that Texas annexation area and everything in blue called the Mexican Cession was permanently taken from Mexico by the United States in 1848 with the end of the Mexican War. Now, very quickly after the war, so 1849, the year after the war, gold is discovered in California. You can imagine how bittersweet this is for Mexico, that as soon as the United States takes California, gold is discovered, creating one of the biggest gold rushes in American history. And very quickly, people flood to California, and California has enough people to want to apply for statehood. Now in Texas, we're building massive amounts of military emplacements, a lot of forts to defend ourselves, nominally from Mexico. We're not too worried about Mexico, but more so from the Indians, in particular the Comanche, who raid into East Texas regularly whenever they pretty much feel like it. And it's going to be another few decades before we're able to fully fight the Comanche in force and push them onto reservations and stop this kind of Native American warfare between the U.S. and the Comanche. Now, not everyone saw the war as a positive thing. Ralph Waldo Emerson said the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic. Mexico will poison us. So what he's alluding to is all this new territory is going to become disputed territory between free states and slave states, ultimately leading to some sort of conflict. So he's kind of foreshadowing the Civil War. So all this land taken is going to be a problem. Now, very quickly, we'll run through the Compromise of 1850, the kind of big attempt to stop a civil war from happening. So all this land, we're debating over what to do with it, particularly California, that very quickly, due to the gold rush, has enough people to become a state. Is it going to be a free state, or is it going to be a slave state? Now, if you remember that Wilmot Proviso set up the Mexican War to already be tied to this issue of slavery. Even though it didn't pass, it became a major issue relating to slavery. Now, 1848, Zachary Taylor runs for the presidency as a Whig. You have the Democrats run a guy named Cass, but running a war hero for the Whigs is going to go very well. And Taylor will win with not a huge margin, but a pretty solid margin in the Electoral College. It's going to be up to Taylor to decide what to do with all this Western territory, all this kind of stuff. And Taylor has his own opinions on this, but the issue is Taylor gets sick. So celebrating the 4th of July, on a hot day in July, he eats his favorite snack, which is iced milk and cherries, has some gastrointestinal issues, and he ultimately will die from complications. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, will then take over. And Fillmore, I'm sure you know all about Fillmore and all his wonderful deeds, but there's not a lot that he did. So he didn't really do much. He was more of a placeholder until the next president took over. But nonetheless, so Taylor was supposed to answer these questions, but it's going to fall to Congress because of his death. So with this Compromise of 1850, by 1850, things bubbled up. And you're going to have a guy named Henry Clay propose something known as the Omnibus Bill. When he said this one bill will solve all of our problems, he crammed everything into it, but no one wanted to vote for it because either the North didn't like something in it or the South didn't like something in it. And Clay couldn't understand why people wouldn't vote for it. He's like, but it solves all our problems. Now, Henry's getting fairly old by this point. He's been around pretty much the entirety of the U.S. history at this point. So he is not a young man anymore, and it's actually going to be the next up-and-coming compromiser, Stephen Douglas, in Congress, that's going to basically take his omnibus bill and break it up into the little parts and get each part passed individually. So the Compromise of 1850 also has 5 major parts. So first, it says California will come in as a free state. Now, while the South may not like that because it's not a slave state, the North and the middle states will kind of vote for it. So there's enough people voting for it. New Mexico and Utah will be decided later. Everyone's kind of okay with that one. They finalized the boundary of Texas. So Texas claimed a lot of stuff in New Mexico, even most of New Mexico. And we finally kind of draw a line. Basically, Texas gives up its extra land claims. In exchange, the government takes over the $10 million of Texas's debt. The South gets a stronger federal Fugitive Slave Act. While the North isn't happy about this, the South and the middle states are able to vote for it, and it still passes. And then we get an end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, you can still own slaves in the capital. You just can't buy and sell them. Now, the South wasn't thrilled about this, but they got the idea that if we're going to sell the United States to the world as America, the land of the free, or we're a democracy, we probably shouldn't be buying and selling people within eyesight of our capital. That just may not go over well. If we're saying we're the land of the free, men get to choose their own path in life, all men are created equal. It's kind of a hard argument to make when diplomats from other countries are like, you say all men are created equal, and then you're buying and selling some people down the street. It just doesn't go well. So people recognize the kind of irony and problem of the slave trade, particularly in the U.S. Capitol. But this is the Compromise of 1850, and it's not going to solve all the problems. It's basically just going to tidy it up long enough to buy us some time. And it's going to be the 1850s where things start ripping themselves apart, and we've got to figure out what the heck is going on, how we're going to do this, and are we going to end up in a civil war? But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with the 1850s kind of in our next video lecture. So we'll stop there for today. Y'all have a great day.